CLL is a common lymphoid leukemia that has a long prognosis, but has an inevitable relapsing and remitting course. So it's very common that patients end up with relapsed and refractory disease, and we need new treatment options. One of the standards of care for the treatment of patients with relapsed and refractory CLL is a combination of bendamustine with rituximab. And the study asked the question, if we add idelalisib to a standard of care, can we improve outcome? So this was a prospective randomized phase 3 trial where we included 416 patients, 207 patients in the bendamustine rituximab plus idelalisib arm, and 209 in the bendamustine rituximab plus placebo arm. Patients were treated until disease progression, 6 months of bendamustine rituximab, and then either placebo or idelalisib until progression. The primary endpoint was progression-free survival, and there was a planned interim analysis when 2/3 of the events had occurred. That happened in October. The Independent Data Safety Monitoring Committee met and recommended that the study be stopped and made available because there was overwhelming efficacy in favor of the experimental arm. So what we found is that bendamustine and rituximab with the placebo had what we expected, about a progression-free survival of 11.1 months. But when idelalisib was added to that, progression-free survival increased to 23.1 months, which represented a 67% reduction in the risk of progression or death. A number of secondary endpoints were met, but one of the most important secondary endpoints, particularly for patients, is that overall survival was improved. So there was, in neither arm was the median overall survival met, but there was a 45% reduction in the risk of death with idelalisib added to bendamustine. So what the take-home message is that if you're planning to treat patients with a standard of care chemotherapy, such as bendamustine or rituximab, addition of idelalisib has important clinical benefit for both progression-free and overall survival. There is some increased toxicity associated with adding idelalisib to the backbone. Idelalisib is associated with increased incidence of colitis, some pneumonitis, and elevated transaminases, and we did see some of that. It tended to be manageable and did not prevent patients from completing treatment, and it did not compromise the overall outcome. There was also an increased risk of febrile neutropenia, but there were no episodes of fatal infection, and again, this was a manageable side effect. But this was a large international study with investigators in Australia, Europe, the United States, and it was a big effort to get all this done, but it represents an important new option for patients. The study was performed as a registrational trial with adequate information. This clinical trial data will be submitted to regulatory authorities both in the US and Europe for approval. I suspect that this approval will come next year. Idelalisib is already approved both by the EMA and by the US FDA for treatment of relapsed refractory CLL in combination with rituximab for patients who aren't candidates to receive chemotherapy. So this is an extension of the indication for the drug. I would expect pretty rapid approval.